Sorry about that. My camera died after 9 minutes of filming for some reason. So let's just keep going. We're on question 5 now. I walked back to the perfect house slowly that afternoon. I could always tell when I got there without looking up, because the sidewalk changed. Suddenly, all the cement squares were perfectly white, and none of them had a single crack, not one. This was also true of the cement squares of the walkway leading up to the perfect house, which were bordered by perfectly matching azalea bushes, all the same height, alternating between pink and white blossoms. The cement squares and azaleas stopped at the perfect stoop, 3 steps, like every other stoop on the block, and then you're up to the 2-story colonial, with 2 windows on each side and 2 dormers on the 2nd floor. It was like every other house on the block except neater, because my father had it painted perfectly white every other year, except for the fake aluminum shutters, which were black, and the aluminum screen door, which gleamed dully and never ever squeaked when you opened it. Inside, I dropped my book on the stairs. "Mom," I called. I thought about getting something to eat, a Twinkie maybe. Then chocolate milk that had more chocolate than milk. And then another Twinkie. After all that sugar, I figured I'd be able to come up with something on how to live with Mrs. Baker for the next 9 months. Either that, or I wouldn't care anymore. "Mom," I called again. I walked past the perfect living room, where no one ever sat, because all the seat cushions were covered in stiff, clear plastic. So that's number 5. You could walk in there and think that everything was for sale. It was so perfect. The carpet looked like it had never been walked on, which it almost hadn't, and the baby grand piano by the window looked like it had never been played, which it definitely hadn't, since none of us could play piano. But if anyone had ever walked in and clinked a key or sniffed the artificial tropical flowers or straightened a tie in the gleaming mirror, they sure would have been impressed at the perfect life of an architect from Hood and Associates. My mother was in the kitchen, fanning air out of the open window and putting out a cigarette, because I wasn't supposed to know that she smoked. And if I did know, I wasn't supposed to say anything. And I really wasn't supposed to tell my father. And that's when it came to me, even before the Twinkie, I needed to have an ally in the war against Mrs. Baker. "How was your first day?" my mother said. "Mom," I said, "Mrs. Baker hates my guts." "Mrs. Baker doesn't hate your guts." She stopped fanning and closed the window. "Yes, she does." "Mrs. Baker hardly knows you." "Mom, it's not like you have to know someone well to hate their guts. You don't sit around and have a long conversation and then decide whether or not to hate their guts. You just do, and she does." "I'm sure that Mrs. Baker's a fine person, and she certainly does not hate your guts." How do parents get to where they can say things like this? There must be some gene that switches on at the birth of the firstborn child, and suddenly stuff like that starts to come out of their mouths. It's like they haven't figured out that the language that you're using is English. You should be able to understand what you're saying, but instead, it's like you pull a string on them and a bad record plays. I guess they can't help it. Right after supper, I went to the den to look for a new ally. "Dad, Mrs. Baker hates my guts." "Can you see that the television is on and that I'm watching Walter Cronkite?" he said. So we listened to Walter Cronkite report on the new casualty figures from Vietnam, and how the air war was being widened, and how 2 new brigades of the 101st Airborne Division were being sent over, until CBS finally threw in a commercial. "Dad, Mrs. Baker hates my guts." "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything. She just hates my guts." "People don't just hate your guts unless you do something to them. So what did you do?" "Nothing. This is Betty Baker, right?" "I guess so." "The same Betty Baker who belongs to the Baker family?" See what I mean about that gene thing? They miss the entire point of what you're saying. "Well, I guess she belongs to the Baker family," I said. "The same Baker family that owns the Baker Sporting Emporium store?" And that is number 6. "Dad, she hates my guts." The same Baker Emporium sporting store, which is about to choose an architect for its new building, and which is currently considering Hood and Associates among its top 3 choices? Dad, so, Holling, what did you do that might make Mrs. Baker hate your guts, which will make other Baker family members hate the name of Hood, which will lead the Baker Sporting Emporium store to choose another architect, which will kill the deal for Hood and Associates, which will drive us into bankruptcy, which will encourage several lending institutions around the state to send representatives to our front stoop holding papers that have lots of legal words on them, none of them good, and which will mean that there will be no Hood and Associates for you to take over when I'm ready to retire. Even though there wasn't much left of the ham and cheese and broccoli omelet, it started to want to come up again. I guess things aren't so bad, I said. Well, you better keep them that way, he said. And that really wasn't what I expected and hoped for in an ally. There was only my sister left. To ask your big sister to be your ally is like asking Nova Scotia to go into battle with you. But I knocked on her door anyway. Loudly the monkeys were playing. She pulled it open and stood there, her hands on her hips. Her lipstick was the color of a new fire engine. Mrs. Baker hates my guts, I told her. So do I, she said. Well, I could use some help with this. Ask Mom. She said that Mrs. Baker doesn't hate my guts. Well, ask Dad. Silence. If you can call it silence when the monkeys are playing. Oh, she said, it might hurt a business deal, right? So he won't help you, the son who is going to inherit Hood and Associates. What am I supposed to do? If I were you, I'd go to California, she said. Try again. She leaned against the door. Mrs. Baker hates your guts, right? I nodded. Well then, Holling, here's my advice. You might try and get some. Some guts, I mean. You're going to need them. And she closed her door. And that is the last answer, number 7.